April 6th, 1812. The walls of Badajoz, southwestern Spain. A British army stands in the darkness outside a city that has already defeated them twice. Wellington's engineers have spent weeks blasting 3 gaps through walls 6 metres thick. The gaps are breached, the assault is ordered. And the men who volunteered to go first, the Forlorn Hope, the lost ones, know their chances of surviving the next 30 minutes are almost zero. They go anyway. This is the siege of Badajoz, the night when Wellington's army suffered more casualties in a few hours than in almost any other single engagement of the Peninsular War. The night when British and Portuguese soldiers showed a quality of courage so extreme, so beyond ordinary human endurance, that Wellington, a man not given to sentiment, wept openly on the battlefield the next morning. And the night whose dark aftermath showed what happens when men who have endured too much, lost too much, and suffered too long are finally let off the leash. But before we reach those walls, we need to understand why Badajoz mattered so much. Because without that context, you cannot grasp the desperation that drove men to charge into the mouth of a fortress they knew might kill every one of them. Welcome to Britain's history. The Peninsular War had been grinding on since 1808. Wellington, then still Sir Arthur Wellesley, had been fighting a careful, methodical campaign across Portugal and Spain, slowly wearing down Napoleon's armies while keeping his own force intact. By early 1812, that strategy had reached a critical moment. Napoleonic France controlled the Iberian Peninsula with 2 great armies, Soult's in the south, Marmont's in the north. So long as those 2 armies could link up and concentrate against Wellington, he could never safely push deep into Spain. 2 fortresses stood at the crossing points of the Portuguese-Spanish border. Capture them both, and the 2 French armies were permanently separated. Wellington could then destroy them individually. Ciudad Rodrigo in the north had already fallen in January 1812, seized in a brilliantly audacious winter assault that shocked the French with its speed. Now, in late March, the entire weight of Wellington's army had shifted south to the second fortress, Badajoz. Badajoz was a different proposition. The city sat on rising ground above the river Guadiana, its ancient walls strengthened and redesigned by the French garrison commander, Brigadier General Armand Philippon, one of the most capable defensive engineers in Napoleon's army. Philippon had already seen off 2 British sieges in 1811. He had used the intervening months to make Badajoz as close to impregnable as engineering ingenuity and sheer ruthlessness could achieve. The walls themselves ran 6 metres high and over 4 metres thick. Fort Picurina covered the most vulnerable approach. The rivers Guadiana and Revillas protected 2 sides of the city. And Philippon had done something remarkable with the areas his engineers knew the British would eventually breach. He had turned them into killing grounds. Where the cannon fire would inevitably blow gaps in the walls, Philippon placed chevaux de frise, enormous wooden beams studded with hundreds of sword blades and iron spikes, chained together so they couldn't be lifted or shifted by hand. At the base of the rubble slopes leading up to those gaps, he flooded sections of the ditch by diverting the revillas, creating unmarked pools deep enough to drown a man in full kit. The dry sections of the ditch were covered with boards spiked with 12-inch iron nails pointing upward. Below the main breach, he laid a chain of massive powder barrels and cannonball clusters as a mine. Behind every gap, he pre-positioned his infantry with 8 loaded muskets per man for continuous fire. And the walls above were stacked with grenades, fire barrels and boulders to be rolled down on anyone who attempted to climb. Wellington knew all of this. He attacked anyway. He had no choice. Soult's relief army was marching north. Time had run out. The siege began on the 16th of March, 1812. For 3 weeks, British artillery hammered the southeastern walls while infantry dug the parallel trenches that crept closer to the city. The work was exhausting, dangerous, and, because Wellington's army lacked a proper corps of trained military engineers, it was done largely by infantry who had no formal training in siegecraft. The Royal Engineers had fewer than 30 officers throughout the entire campaign. Ordinary soldiers dug, carried and died doing work that should have been done by specialists. Every day brought French counterfire. Every night brought French sorties against the trenches. The siege progressed, but it bled the army before the assault even began. By the 5th of April, the artillery had blown 3 breaches in the southeastern walls: the main breach at Santa Maria, the smaller Trinidad breach, and a third at the connecting curtain wall. Wellington's chief engineer reported the gaps were passable. The assault was set for the night of the 6th of April, and this is where the Forlorn Hope enters the story. In the siege warfare of the Napoleonic era, the assault on a fortified breach required someone to go first. Before the main attack columns could advance, a small advance party had to lead the way. To draw the defensive fire, trigger any mines and show the main body where to go, these were the Forlorn Hope. Volunteers who understood that their survival was not the point. The point was to die usefully enough that the men behind them could get through. The word comes from the Dutch Verloren Hoop, lost troop. It described exactly what these men were. The logic of volunteering is not as simple as it sounds. In the British Army of 1812, promotion was almost impossible without either money to buy a commission or an act of conspicuous bravery that forced the army to take notice. An ensign who led a Forlorn Hope and survived was promoted instantly to lieutenant. A sergeant who survived became an officer. For men with ability and no money, it was the single fastest route to advancement the army offered. If they lived, many did not. The casualty rate among Forlorn Hope volunteers at Ciudad Rodrigo had been devastating. At Badajoz, no one expected it to be better. Wellington's attack plan had 4 separate thrusts. The main effort, the 4th Division and the Light Division, would hit the 3 breaches in the southeast. The 3rd Division under General Picton would attempt to escalade the castle's 30-metre walls to the northeast using ladders. An assault Wellington considered a diversion, but authorised because Picton argued for it. The 5th Division would create a diversion at the San Vicente bastion in the northwest. Portuguese troops would demonstrate against Fort San Cristobal across the river. The plan assumed the breaches would fall. It was the castle escalade and the San Vicente diversion that Wellington privately expected to fail. At 10 o'clock on the night of the 6th of April, 1812, the assault began. The Light Division and 4th Division moved up in darkness toward the main breaches. The Forlorn Hope parties went ahead. Small groups of officers and volunteers picking their way across ground they couldn't see toward walls they knew were waiting to kill them. When the French garrison heard them coming, they lit the darkness with fireballs. Burning tar barrels flung from the walls that illuminated the ditch and the approaching British columns in flickering orange light. Then Philippon's killing ground opened up. The mines under the breaches detonated. The powder barrels and packed cannonballs went off in a chain of explosions that tore apart the leading companies of the Forlorn Hope and the advance parties of both divisions. Survivors pressed forward. The French garrison, pre-positioned behind their inner defences, opened continuous musket fire into the ditch. Hundreds of muskets, each man with 8 loaded weapons, creating a wall of fire that never paused. Men climbed the rubble slopes and hit the chevaux de frise. The sword blades stopped them. Grenades and fire barrels rolled down from above. Boulders followed, the ditch filled with bodies. And the next wave came on anyway. Over the next 2 hours, the 4th Division and the Light Division made more than 40 separate attempts to force the 3 breaches. Each attempt was destroyed. Each time men reached the chevaux de frise and could not get through, other men climbed over their bodies and tried again. Officers led from the front, which is why officer casualties were catastrophic. 1 officer for every 11 men, compared to the usual ratio. The 43rd Regiment lost 341 men in the ditch. The 52nd lost 320. The 95th Rifles, the Light Division's finest, lost 194. The assault was not failing through lack of courage. It was failing because Philippon had created a position that courage alone could not take. Wellington, watching from a nearby ridge, received report after report of failure. Men dying, breaches unforced. He was close to ordering the Light and 4th Divisions to pull back entirely when word arrived from the opposite side of the city. Major General Thomas Picton's 3rd Division had reached the castle walls. Picton was a Welshman of notorious temper and exceptional ability. He had been shot through the hip crossing the Revillas. The ball tore through him and lodged near his spine, a wound that would have taken most men off the field. Picton kept going. His division had waded chest-deep through the flooded ditch in the darkness and reached the base of the castle's 30-metre walls. The ladders they'd brought were shorter than the walls. The first attempts failed. Ladders pushed away by defenders with hooked poles, men falling back into the ditch. Then Major Henry Ridge of the 5th Regiment found what he was looking for, a section of wall that was lower than the rest, with a single embrasure, a gap cut for a cannon, that could be used as a handhold. Ridge got a ladder against that section. He climbed it himself, leading from the absolute front. He reached the top. Men followed. The 5th Regiment poured over the wall into the castle. The Hesse-Darmstadt troops defending that section were taken completely off guard. They broke. The castle fell. Henry Ridge, who had broken Badajos's defences when nothing else could, was shot dead moments after his men crossed the wall. He never saw the fortress he had taken. At almost the same moment, on the western side of the city, the 5th Division's diversion had turned into something else entirely. The 5th Division's assault on the San Vicente bastion had been planned as a feint. Make noise, draw French attention. Do not expect to succeed. But the division's commanders, seeing the opportunity in the chaos, pressed their attack with full force. The escalade was chaotic. Portuguese soldiers panicked under fire and dropped their ladders. The leading companies had to retrieve them and carry them forward again. When they reached the 9-metre walls of San Vicente, the defenders were concentrated elsewhere. The division went over the wall. One of the first men into San Vicente was a young major on Wellington's personal staff named Fitzroy Somerset, the future Lord Raglan, who would command British forces in the Crimean War 4 decades later. That night he was young, unknown, and among the first over a wall. He had no orders to take. Once inside, the 5th Division opened the city gates from within and spread into the streets, rolling up the French defences from behind. Philippon, caught between the castle, lost, the eastern breaches now irrelevant, and the 5th Division spreading through his city made the only rational decision available. He and his remaining garrison pulled back across the Guadiana to Fort San Cristobal. The following morning, with no hope of relief and no ammunition remaining, he surrendered. Badajoz had fallen. The cost was staggering. Nearly 5,000 British and Portuguese soldiers killed or wounded, over 3,000 of them, in just those 2 hours at the breaches. The numbers are abstract until you break them down by regiment and realise that some of Wellington's finest battalions had ceased to exist as effective fighting units in a single night. The Light Division, the Army's elite formation, had lost 40% of its strength. Wellington rode through the aftermath and wept. It was one of the very few times anyone saw him cry. In his official dispatch, he called it the greatest feat of arms in the war, and meant it. He also privately condemned the system that had forced him to spend his soldiers' lives so lavishly. The British Army needed a proper corps of trained military engineers, sappers and miners who could conduct a technical siege without relying on infantry courage to substitute for professional expertise. The argument was eventually heard. The Royal Sappers and Miners were formally established the following year, the direct institutional consequence of what Badajoz had cost. The strategic consequences were immediate and decisive. Badajoz in British hands permanently severed the line of communication between Soult's army in Andalusia and Marmont's army in central Spain. They could no longer concentrate against Wellington without a fight. 3 months later, in July 1812, Wellington caught Marmont's army manoeuvring out of position near Salamanca and destroyed it in 40 minutes. One of the most brilliant offensive actions in British military history. Badajoz made Salamanca possible, and Salamanca broke French power in Spain. But the fall of Badajoz has another chapter, one that British military history has never quite resolved how to tell. In the siege warfare conventions of the era, a city taken by storm after the garrison refused to surrender was considered by the grim customs of the age open to sack. Wellington's soldiers knew this. Some had been told informally that the city would be theirs if they took it. What happened over the next 3 days went far beyond anything that custom sanctioned. The soldiers who forced the breaches, who who had watched their friends die in the ditch, who had themselves climbed over corpses and through sword blades and through fire, entered Badajoz and came apart. The psychological trauma of what they'd endured, combined with alcohol found in the city's wine cellars and the complete collapse of normal authority, created 3 days of violence that shocked even men hardened by years of campaigning. Eyewitnesses recorded what happened in letters home, in memoirs, in regimental histories. The accounts are harrowing. Wellington moved quickly to reassert order. Gallows were erected in the town square, flogging parties were sent through the streets. It took 72 hours before discipline was fully restored. The official casualty figures for Spanish civilians were never properly compiled. The number was not small. Wellington later described the soldiers who had stormed Badajoz as having displayed the greatest bravery, and then described the same men, in a different context, as the scum of the earth. The two statements are not contradictory. Both were true on the same night, about the same men. That is what made Badajoz so difficult to comprehend and so impossible to forget. Out of the darkness and smoke of those 3 days came one story that has endured differently from the rest. On the second day of the aftermath, 2 young women made their way through the chaos to the camp of the 95th Rifles, seeking protection from the violence in the city. The younger sister was Juana Maria de los Dolores de Leon, 14 years old, from a noble Spanish family. A 24-year-old officer of the 95th, Captain Harry Smith, encountered her. He was struck by her courage. She was terrified but composed, conducting herself with a dignity that the situation gave her no reason to maintain. Within 48 hours, Smith had proposed marriage. Within 2 weeks, with Wellington himself giving the bride away, they were married in a field outside Badajoz. Juana Smith spent the rest of the Peninsular campaign with her husband, riding with the army, learning English, becoming one of the most admired figures in Wellington's force. When Harry Smith was later appointed governor of the Cape Colony and then of the new colony established in South Africa, a town was named for his wife. That town still exists. Ladysmith, in KwaZulu-Natal. The same Ladysmith that would be besieged by a different enemy in a different war, in 1899. The siege of Badajoz lasted 3 weeks of formal operations and 2 hours of assault. The casualties at the breaches exceeded the losses of many full-scale battles. The fortress fell through the castle wall and the San Vicente bastion, the diversions, while the main attack bled itself dry against defences it could not break. Major Henry Ridge, who found the one weak point in 30 metres of wall and climbed it himself, did not live to see the city fall. He died on the wall he had just taken. Wellington said it was the greatest feat of arms his army ever performed. He was probably right, and it is worth sitting with that for a moment, that the most extraordinary act of sustained courage in Wellington's entire war, the assault that made the rest of the campaign possible, was also the night that cost him more men per hour than almost any other engagement he ever fought. That is the measure of what Badajoz required, and that is why when you read the regimental histories of the regiments that were there, the word they most often use to describe the men who went into the ditch that night is not heroic or glorious. The word they use is simply unbreakable. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, the extraordinary human endurance, the tactical ingenuity, the stories of men who achieved the impossible at enormous cost, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told exactly as they happened. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that mattered told the way they deserved.